finding out? Are we getting a better respect for the appreciation for breadth rather than just depth? And yeah, I guess we'll start there. I mean, is that an accurate statement from my standpoint there?
I think that's very, I mean, you said a lot of stuff that really resonates with me and the things I was researching. And I think that's accurate. I think there's a growing appreciation of the need to view systems as systems instead of as these disparate parts that you can look at individually. I don't think we're there on helping people do that. I think people are recognizing the importance of doing that and saying, like, okay, let's be interdisciplinary, but not so much setting up systems that actually help people figure out how to do that, because I don't think it's necessarily, you know, certain great habits of mind will always be intuitive for certain people, but I don't think this is, I think people view this as something intuitive, like just be broader, just integrate, but it's actually something that has to be learned, like a lot of other things, and it shows up everywhere. I mean, when I was looking into this sort of increasing specialization in medicine, for example, right? Like, not very long ago, a cardiologist would be the epitome of specialization, or at least up there. Now, for a cardiologist to be specialized, they might look only at cardiac valves, like the little, you know, flaps of muscle that open like one-way doors, and the electricity of the heart, you know, the rest of the muscle of the heart out of their purview. Just right. So we know more about the function of the heart than ever, and yet what are our, you know, most common sort of epidemic diseases are heart disease, right? So it turns out that in many cases we can have these cardiologists that can make the valve not floppy or make the valve work right, and they use that as a proxy for the outcome that they're really going through, or what's called a surrogate outcome. Basically, they say, okay, there's a problem with the valve here, let's fix the problem with the valve. But what you really care about is that the person doesn't have a heart attack or a stroke or survives. And it turns out that when you start to zoom out and look at those outcomes that you actually care about, they're unchanged in many cases. And this has been the case even for like some of the most popular blood pressure medications. It turns out that you can lower someone's blood pressure, and we can use that. What you really care about is them having a heart attack or a stroke. But then you look and you just see they're dying at the exact same rates, just with a lot better blood pressure numbers.
Yeah, right.
That surrogate marker, the system's actually a lot more complex than that surrogate marker tells you. And in every, I saw analogs for this and included a lot of them, you know, in my writing. In every industry, like I came across this issue with banks. There was a big problem. Part of the financial crisis was because all of the regulators were focused on a very tiny area, and none of them were looking at the provision of credit, which crosses the entire financial system. But then even in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there was a program to help people stay in their homes, where the government went to the banks and said, look, this person meets certain criteria, like they're still employed, for example. They can continue making payments, they just can't make the same payment that they were making before. Let them make a lesser payment, we'll make up part of the difference. You'll be getting less total money, but you'll still be getting paid. And you don't want to have to foreclose on a bajillion houses that nobody's buying houses for. So that gets implemented to help people stay in their homes. And what happens in big banks is one arm of the bank then says, okay, we're lowering mortgage payments for these people to help them stay in their home. And another arm of the bank that's tasked with looking at foreclosures notices that they're suddenly paying less and forecloses on the house. The same bank, right? So there was so much siloing that this was meant to help people. And government regulators talked about that. They just said we had no idea that there was this much siloing within a given bank, that they wouldn't realize they were working against each other. You know, and so I think it's very much akin to what you're talking about with the hamstring. We can know much more about, you know, this sort of reductionist view of things, and at the same time kind of less about what's going on in the greater system. And I think it's an important question to ask of, should our priority be on knowing more at this granular level, or figuring out how to make the things we already know work, be integrated in the system and understood in this greater system? And so I think you hit on a great point, and it reminds me of something that maybe you should think about using in a course called Beer Game at MIT, that MIT Sloan students play. I think a lot of them, I don't know if all of them play when they go, and it's basically a simulation created by a professor where students take different roles in a beer distribution company. There's like the brewer, the wholesaler, distributor, and then the retail person, and they flip cards, and it says, okay, this many customers want this many cases of beer this month. The retailer gets that, and so it spreads down the chain, the supply chain, and the wholesalers and the distributors, they all have to do their part. And what happens is they end up with these like incredible backlogs. It's incredibly inefficient. And it turns out that everyone thinks like it's the next step in the pipeline's fault. And the only way to sort of reduce ending up with this like huge backlog of orders that you can't sell is for someone to basically be like looking at what everyone is doing, even when the individual parts are allowed to communicate with each other. So at first, the first way the simulation is done is not allowed to talk to each other. They just like, the numbers of numbers. But it turns out they don't do better when they are allowed to talk to each other. It's going to take someone who is looking across all of them are doing. When they're allowed to talk to each other, they talk to the next person, and they all end up like blaming each other for being the cinched hose, sort of. And I think the point of that game is to demonstrate that, you know, if you might blame people as a specific step in the pipeline, but really what you need to do is set up a system by which these parts like work together, basically, instead of just assigning it separately. And so if you don't have anyone who's looking at the whole system, you will necessarily every time end up with these perverse outcomes where everyone's blaming the next person instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you identify industries that they're doing a better job of that, or examples of? I mean, like I said, we haven't spoken a lot about the specifics of the book, but do you have an endpoint solution to this, other than just that? An understanding, yeah, we need to do this better, but how to do that? I mean, these are difficult, challenging, wicked problems, or whatever you want to call them, for a reason, because they're really hard. And reductionist problems and small problems are relatively really easy, and we can sort of fool ourselves into thinking that we're progressing when clearly in many instances we're not, right?
Right. Reductionism, I mean, it's a lot easier to attack, right? You know where the problem is, and you just drill down on it, versus kind of having to make ad hoc system solutions to everything. I think there are places that we're doing better. Like, for example, I spent some time, and this is not in the book, but I spent some time with the analytics team at UPS. Okay, and I would have never thought that UPS would be a fascinating company, right? Like whatever, like kind of drab brown trucks and like packages. But they have this. They deal with what's called the traveling salesman problem, which is what's the most efficient way to get between a certain number of stops. That's the traveling salesman problem, and it's become a much bigger problem now with e-commerce. So they used to have whatever 40 stops a day. Now an average driver has like 150 stops a day. And so that caused what's called combinatorial explosion. There's so many different, there's like more different possibilities than like atoms in the universe and ways to do that. It's remarkably complex. Mm-hmm. And so there's not even a perfect solution that's known for this. They're just sort of local best solutions. So the way that computer algorithms try to solve this problem is just by trying a bunch of stuff and improving like one step at a time. But then you put that in the real world and you're dealing with traffic and like fuel economy and all these other things in context. And so they have this incredible analytics team that spends all their time like working on the traveling salesman problem and then integrating that into their drivers, and they make everyone work as a delivery person. The CEO of the company had worked as a delivery person. The mathematician on the analytics team works as a delivery person, because what they found was that working on the algorithm was difficult, but the most difficult is what they called change management. Or how do you incorporate this into what people are actually doing every day? And I think to give them the kind of insight they needed for that, they basically took them away from what the main job is. I mean, that's a pretty hard thing to do, to take a mathematician away and say, you're going to work in the delivery truck for a little while, to understand how some of this works. And I think that's a risk, because you're taking time away from their specialty, right? So you have to really be willing to invest in it. But again, even the CEO there, worked as a delivery person. And I think that gave their team much better understanding of the realities they were dealing with. Where on the opposite end of the spectrum, I was contacted by an NBA team that I think I'm not really supposed to like name them, it doesn't matter what team they are anyway, where they wanted to, get more into sports science, and so they hired like a very prominent scientist as their sports science coordinator. And a year later, we're like, basically what he does is say, well, here are the results from the labs, do with them what you will. And they parted ways not so amicably, because that's not useful, right? What you needed, someone who knows how to find things out, understands that the coach is the decision maker. How does this stuff aid his decision making, as opposed to saying, well, here are these results from this. Basically, what to the coach is a vacuum. It might as well be a vacuum, I bestow them upon you, do what you will.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's the norm right now. I mean, that's how it works.
I mean,
go ahead, sir.
I was just saying, and you said something to me that stuck with me, maybe in like an email exchange or something one time, where you said, we have and if you don't want to be saying this out loud, then obviously you can just edit this part out. But where you said, we have these old coaches who are great communicators and great motivators, and then we have a lot of young coaches who know their physiology inside and out and suck at communicating, right? Yeah. And I can see the attraction of that, because you bring this sort of allure of knowing all this physiology, but really that physiology should be it's subservient to your decision making, right? I think of this even in, like, if I talk to creative writers who go through an MFA program, they're like, you learn all these rules of writing, and then you kind of like forget them. They're there if you need them to help your decision making, but you don't want that stuff to be running you. Like, you want to be running it. And so I think, with how much science is available and how much emphasis there is on like having the credential of being a science person, it can really be lost the fact that that's supposed to serve the decision making, not the other way around.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So from let's go from an identification standpoint, right? So it's been clear for a long time to many, many people that this is a problem.
Yeah.
Why aren't we, and I mean the royal we as an entire society, haven't really come to grasp with that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, because you go back 250 years and Goethe and what he was talking about with holism and the importance of not getting too focused on the details of something, and making sure that we synthesize as well as analyze, and then Hegel and then systems thinking and complexity science and chaos engineering, all of these things. And we understand it, we know it, we see the importance of it, but we don't do anything about it. Is it simply just because it's a bridge too far and it's too difficult for us, or is there some other motivation to more reductive means, or maybe it's just tradition and this is the way it's set up, and this ship is just too difficult to turn around?
That's a great question, and it also reminds me of something I should have added to your last point, so I hope you don't mind if I digress.
No, please. Yeah.
Which is, if I had to think of what I think is one of the most important things for trying to foster this integration that we're talking about, where that I think people increasingly recognize as important, but somehow leave up to its own devices if it's just going to materialize, is having a strong informal culture in an organization. So I think there are a lot of organizations that have strong formal culture. They have their processes laid out, they have their identity, and those sorts of things, but do not have very strong informal culture. So like Bill Gore, who went up on Gore-Tex, noticed that the most creative work done by organizations he had worked for was when they were in crisis, because disciplinary boundaries would go out the window and people would start talking about work in the carpool. So he would say, like, real work done at the carpool or at lunch, or I don't know if you know the Santa Fe Institute, which is and one of I was talking to Michael Maubison, who's on the board there, about some of the inspiration for he asked, like, sort of one of his mentors, what's the most important thing for this kind of systems thinking, and his mentor told him lunch, these informal places where people mingle. And that's like not as, it's related to the question you asked, because it's not as sexy of an answer as, build the Google Open Office plan and whatever other like hacking types of things you have to have. But I do think that having strong informal culture is, to go with strong formal culture is a major part of what sort of foments that. People get interested in each other and start to want to understand how the rest of the place works. But I think there are a lot of forces that augur against that. The drive to reductionism and specialization, I think some of it is signaling, right? But signaling's been on my mind a lot because of this college admissions crisis that we're looking at. And it's like with anything, I can't remember the name of what this law is, though I could look it up, where as soon as something becomes a measure, it becomes a status symbol, and then the measure itself becomes an end as opposed to progress.
Yep.
And I think specialization has a huge signaling benefit. I mean, I can feel for myself whenever I move niches in work, it's really psychologically unsettling. And some of the really interesting discussion about that has been by a guy named Andre Geim, who discovered graphene. He's a physicist. He won the Nobel Prize for discovering graphene, this single atom thick material that's incredibly strong and a great electrical conductor that was thought to be only theoretical. And he does, and this I do write about in the last chapter. he does what he calls Friday night experiments, where totally unfunded, everyone like take off the strictures of the week and just like goof around with stuff and explores. He likes to say he doesn't do research, only search, because he changes the name sort of every couple of years.
Yeah.
And his biggest, so he's the only person I think who's won both the Ig Nobel Prize, which is for research that seems ridiculous, and the Nobel Prize.
Oh, really? Interesting. What's his name?
Andre Geim, Geim, and he you know, and he will say he's won the Nobel Prize, and he will say it's really psychologically unsafe feeling when I'm always switching these domains. Like since I was a grad student, I've been told stick with this or you'll get behind, right?
Yeah,
and his thing is kind of like, but I have a long career to go, and this isn't the most interesting to me. So
right, yeah,
right. It's like classic sunk cost fallacy, right? There's a woman, an engineer, who's one of the corporate scientists at 3M that I talk about in the book a little. Corporate scientist means they're like one of the 20 biggest contributors, kind of. That's the highest title. Okay. And she says she was working on her PhD in college, and after like a year, so not even like at her master's, she wanted to switch. She wasn't so interested in the work, and was told like, don't switch now, you'll get so far behind. This is someone who was like 23, facing how long is their work life going to be, and already being told like, you can't switch now, like you've put in a year of grad school, you know. And she switched and switched and switched over and over again. It became that was another place that I think had a good kind of recognize the need to mix specialists and generalists, where she says, she was telling me like, I'm not that great a scientist, I'm not even working in the field that I trained in at all. What I call my process mosaic building, where I have an idea, I start going around and talking to some of the specialists that are in our office building, and I put one tile in the mosaic at a time. They don't know what each other are doing. Eventually, I've got this full picture where I'm like, you guys are all doing work that bears on one another, but don't really know it. And it leads to me having this question that, you know, I can get people involved in. And she became, you know, really incredibly successful that way. But said, again, the same way that like, when I would talk to people like that, they would say like, well, I'm doing it wrong. You know, I don't do what you should do, which is just pick a specialty and like drill into it, even though they had been incredibly successful not doing that. So I think a lot of it is just about credentialing, you know, and kind of psychological security, and this feeling that there's so much knowledge that if you want to be able to add value, you have to spend so much time just getting to the frontier of a specific area of knowledge, and less value on the idea that really can add knowledge. Right? That was a bit of a revelation for me, even as a writer. I figured once I left science, when I was living in a tent in the Arctic doing like geology research, and started to think it's getting so specific. Am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning one or two things new to the world, much shorter spans of time learning things new to me and translating to that? Was the latter. Then I also sort of realized later, because the people who are like what I was at that time don't know, you know, are in this system of parallel trenches where there's useful stuff in the next trench, but they're not standing up and looking down at it. You actually can add knowledge value by integrating some of what they're doing and letting them know what other people are doing. So I sort of feel like actually, instead of just translating, you know, and maybe I'm being too kind to myself, you actually can add a form of knowledge in the form of this sort of integration, because it's not going to happen by itself. So it provides opportunities, I think, for people like me, basically.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So it's almost, you know, we talked a little bit about in the neo-generalist on some of the emails that we've sent back and forth. It's kind of what you're talking about there is almost a neo-generalist system. So not a neo-generalist within an individual, but you've got generalists, gatekeepers that can take the specialized understanding or knowledge from all of these specialists, and the gatekeepers can then link them all together and come up with a system that encapsulates it and hopefully leads in the right direction. Where in their book, The Neo-Generalist, that the individual is that, right? We can specialize on one thing, but the truly successful, creative people, however you want to define that, are the ones that see that in context and put the connections together. So I guess it's you know, I guess it's both, right? I mean, it's always going to be both.
It's both, and in fact, there's some research both in technological patents and in comic book creation that I go through in the book that shows that in many cases you cannot recreate the benefits of diverse experience within an individual by getting a group of people who have the same experience by platoon, which was a bit of a surprise to me, right? So if you look at, so even though you need to have that, like, so for the more difficult, the more wicked the question was, like in technological areas, the more unknown the next steps were. So you could see in some areas of technology, there'd be lots of patents that were sort of stepwise progression. And in other areas, there'd be like tons of patents, most of which were totally useless and some of which were total paradigm shifters. And in those areas, it was the contributions of people themselves had worked across a huge number of technological classes, had more predictive power in making a breakthrough than did teams that had the same number of technological class experience brought together. So,
right.
and the same creators, and having worked in 4 different genres, the likelihood that someone would have a blockbuster as an individual crossed over the likelihood from a team that had the same amount of genre experience. And the people who wrote that paper called Superman or the Fantastic Four. Like, you want one person who's integrating, or
right.
And I can send you that paper.
Yeah, perfect.
And so they said, like, it appears, at least in this domain, the best unit of integration is the individual, where having the group with diverse experience come together is definitely a benefit compared to not having that. But the very best thing is an individual who has a lot of that diverse experience. So their conclusion was sort of like, Superman if you can get him, if not, go for Fantastic Four.
That's great. That's awesome. Do you see this trending in the right direction? Like, are we, as far as a better appreciation for you're not?
I mostly don't. No. I think the appreciation is trending in the right direction in some way.
Okay.
The actual.
Yeah, the application isn't.
Yeah. So So one of the ways that I got motivated to write this book was, there were a couple things that sort of came together, but one of them was I got involved with the Pat Tillman Foundation.
Okay.
And they give scholarships and career development to veterans, soldiers, and military spouses. And I gave a talk to them about a little bit about what I was learning before I had any idea of writing a book, about the benefits of sometimes like delaying specialization or having some sampling experience before specializing. And like, it was like 15 people maybe. And they were all Tillman scholars. They were all veterans who were or military spouses being funded to change careers in some way or another. And it was like as if I had been like, their psychologist or something. Like, they were coming up after like a Navy SEAL who had studied undergrad geophysics and history and was currently in grad school at Dartmouth and Harvard, sent me a note afterward saying, I'm so relieved that like it's not over for me, that, I'm like, what the, like, you're, how the fact that you've been made to feel that way, because you've been told by these employees, like, you have sort of a gap in the experience we'd normally look for. The fact that he felt behind, to me, was like crazy, because he'd been spending that time getting these incredibly inimitable, experiences that I think will be a huge asset in whatever he chooses to do, even if he's behind on some of the specific domain-specific skills. And so that really sort of opened my eyes to this thing that I was sort of feeling as I changed jobs, was pretty pervasive among people who had even done these incredible things. This feeling where they were told by these employers that, like, you don't exactly have like the experience we're looking for. And so I think I started to feel like there are these HR policies out there that might accidentally screen out the employees that are, the most capable of making important and creative contributions, because they have such like well-defined slots that they want to fit people into. So even while I think there's a recognition that some of this integration is important, I think there's less sort of putting the money where the mouth is, and more saying, like, if someone is able to do this on their own, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Do you see that this being a sort of a bottom-up process or a top-down process as far as moving in that direction? I mean, for example, right? So the average career length of somebody a couple of decades ago, and I don't know the stats, but it would be significantly longer than what it is now, right? So as far as career at one company being, so now maybe the stats now are 2.5, 3 years at one company, and then they move on. So there's more opportunities to move into separate domains and different things. So that would be more of a bottom-up process, and people figuring out that, life is more than just, picking a job when you're 17 or 21 and then just working that for the next 40 years. So we are trending that way anyway.
Yep.
And then, the flip side of that from a top-down perspective, for example, I listen to Brian Koppelman's The Moment podcast a lot. I think it's awesome. And this week he had Mark Andreessen on. Mark, the guy that developed the web browser, right? So Netscape and whatever the other one was. And he's for the first one, a real leader in now, VC culture and in industry as a whole. He's talking about complex adaptive systems and looking at problems from a holistic standpoint and starting here at 1,000-foot view rather than zeroing in. And you don't see that a lot from the people at the top, even though that they may be doing it, right? So I think for me, it seems, and maybe it's just I'm self-selecting because this is my area of study and has been for a long time, and I'm really interested in it. And the more I read about it, the more I sort of am open to all of the increasing research and the increasing number of people that are getting interested in it. So maybe it's just me and I'm stuck in the weeds a little bit, but I sort of see it trending that way.
I hope so. And I think, you mentioned obviously Andreessen is a big business guy. And I do think there's some, like the business world is not something I thought I would have ever been interested in or that they would ever be interested in me. But I think a lot of those people are interested in performance, and people who are interested in performance are interested in performance. And it doesn't matter if that's a chef or a pilot or an athlete. And I do think there are some like venture capital firms, for example, some of those I've had a little interaction with, I think they view themselves as, we don't really necessarily have to invent some new piece of technology. We're looking from higher up and seeing these technologies that have been used in one area that could be really useful in other areas, just not paying attention to them.
Yeah, right.
And so a lot of the times that's sort of what they're doing, is they're like helping someone realize that something they do works in some other system. And so I do think it's manifesting in kind of that way, because some of the people who've done well at that are taking that higher view. And I certainly hope so. And I mean, one of my goals is I hope that I provide a little bit of ammunition for people who want to say maybe this is a good thing. I know that would just be one tiny drop, but there should be increasing recognition of this. And even in things that people, like, again, medicine is a great place to look, because there have been some really poor outcomes from hyper specialization. And I think when you look at surveys, people vastly overestimate the contributions to life expectancy of medical technology compared to things like public health initiatives that are done on a system level. Like, that accounts for most of, even the polio vaccine in terms of infectious disease is like this. When you look at things like canned food and general sanitation practices, like these system-wide things.
Right.
And so I think those are great places to look, but it's really hard to convince people of that, right? Because if there's something going on, like, you want the person who's only studied the heart valve for their entire life, even if that's a marker, isn't key to the system.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also difficult from the specialist standpoint too, right? Because there's comfort in that.
Yeah. Oh, and I think and I don't mean to denigrate specialists at all. Like, we need specialists, I think, but I don't think we're in danger of deprioritizing the importance of specialists anytime soon. So,
no, I don't think so either. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need them, and there's, but also I think it's also true, and again, this shows up in some patent research I discussed, that we may not need as many in a particular area as we did in the past, because their information is communicated much more widely, much more quickly, and there's more knowledge out there than all the integrators in the world have time to.
There's probably some fields where we still need to go significantly deeper in, right?
For sure.
And there's other fields that, okay, that's for the bang for the buck. I mean, what are we doing here?
For sure.
We're better off stepping back and understanding the connections between things.
Totally.
That's for me. That's where we are in sport, and I don't think there's a full appreciation or realization of that yet, because it is such a young field. Whether it's sports science in sport, or just sport as being a professional industry is how many decades old? That's it. It's 30-40 years old, really. That's it. And so we're still trying to justify our own individual roles and positions within this industry. So it's difficult for us to step back and understand what really matters.
I mean, in coaching, when I think of integrators, like coaching, you have the task of, there's a lot of stuff that's known. Like, a lot of the basics are the basics, and people might apply those things in different ways. But I think one of the reasons why you're so willing to share things about training online is because it's not a secret necessarily. One, you're probably just oriented toward learning and sharing, but also um, there aren't these like magical secrets and hacks. And yet the challenge is, how do you apply this stuff? I bet there's literally never two athletes where you're applying it in the exact same way. Like it's how do you take that and apply it to this completely, totally unique context of this actual individual? So there you can see a system where you're taking things that a lot of them are pretty basic and well known, and so well known and such not like a secret competitive hack that you're willing to share it on Twitter. But then the real, where the rubber meets the road is, how do you put this in the context of this totally unique person, their totally unique situation that you're working with? So I sort of think, that's one why the job is probably never the same and remains compelling day after day and year after year, why it's incredibly challenging, because you're always adjusting that new context, and also why it's really important, even if we knew all of the reductionists, why it still wouldn't be like, well, now we can have an algorithm be the coach. We never would, I think.
Yeah, I think it's similar with any profession that are working with humans.
Yeah.
So it's you can't. My job will never be replaced by AI.
Yeah.
No therapist job will ever be replaced by AI. We're dealing with complex systems within a complex environment, doing complex things and interacting with other complex systems. So by definition, I mean, this is never going to be reduced. It can't be reduced.
Yeah.
And the best practitioners within sport are the ones that are the uber generalists. I gave a presentation a few years ago where, and it's a cliche, right? Is it a sport? Sorry, is it a philosophy, or is it a science? Or sorry, is it an art, or is it a science? And the way that I sort of spun it is, science is knowing more and more and more about less and less and less, until eventually you know everything about absolutely nothing. And the opposite, right? So it's philosophy or art, or however you want to define that, is knowing less and less and less about more and more and more, until you eventually know nothing about everything. And that's essentially where I believe sport is. I mean, we need to do a much better job of the latter, and a lot less. It's a lot less time needs to be spent on the former, in my mind. And I think it's when you look at all the best people across sport, whether it be the coaches or the medical doctors or the therapists or even the psychologists, I mean, the nutritionists, the best ones are the ones that can put all of their specialist information, understand it in context, and then communicate that in a way which makes sense in regards to all of the other stuff that is important as well. So that's sort of what we're doing here. And I really look forward to your book, because it seems like there's a lot of crossover there.
Yeah, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. And just as you were explaining that, I mean, it just reminds me, I kind of think coaching is, there's a lot, it could be used really in every industry, and there's not enough, like, it's easy, people are used to it in the sports world, but I kind of think every industry would benefit from it. So I would be interested, if the extent that great coaches are great generalists, I think a lot of other industries would do better to, and I think there's been like some lip service to adopting coaching in a lot of other industries, but it's maybe not exactly what I'm thinking of. But that they should reach out, and because like I just can't. Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, businesses have to decide very carefully about where to put their investments, but I think they get more bang than they think if they have.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like that industry that's developing, the business coaching industry, is just very shallow. It's very on the surface right now.
I'm not sure what it's like coaching exactly in the way that I think of coaching.
Right, right. It's opportunities for these external consultants to come in and make some money at this point. It's not really truly coaching, but I'll be interested to see where that goes in the future as well, and what can be learned, and whether they do figure out that they can actually learn from what is at this point, coaching profession has been around for a little while, longer than the sport performance industry, and what, the integration of all these things. So there is an opportunity there, I think, for business culture to learn something. But, bringing in a coach and talking for 45 minutes to your team, that's not it.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that's the thing, right? We were just talking about how important it is to use that context, and obviously, if you don't have any sense of that context, if you're swooping in the mouth, sort of thing.
Yeah. Anyways, man, I really appreciate your time. I've taken probably too much of it already.